Welcome, everyone. I am Chen Jinghua at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's campus are situated within the traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and in the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Siaher Okanagan Nation and their peoples. We are grateful for the cares of this land from time immemorial. I would like to welcome and thank you all for joining us today for this lecture titled Zhao Puchu's Concepts of Buddhism as Cultural and Revival of Buddhism in Contemporary Mainland China. This lecture is the 20th lectures of Yin-Cheng Distinguished Lecture Series and the 4th lectures hosted by UBC. The lecture series is part of the Yin-Cheng Network for Buddhist Studies, which began in 2021 as an international collaboration between 7 top institutions in North America, Europe, and East Asia. The goal of the lecture series is to invite leading Buddhist scholars to discuss Buddhism's role in addressing severe crises faced by modern humanity. I would like to thank the Tzu Chi Foundation, including CEO Yan Bowen and Professors He Risheng, for their support in enabling the lecture series and the lab work. Last but not least, I would like to thank our speaker, Professor Shen Kai, and discussant, Professor Fan Wenli, for presenting at this event. We look forward to the publications of this paper in a forthcoming issue of the Yin-Cheng Journal for Contemporary Buddhism. I now would like to invite Professors Lei He from Tzu Chi University to say a few words.
Greeting to everyone joining this lecture, whether online or in person. I would like to begin my expression my gratitude to Professor Junhua Chen and his team, Vicky and Carol, for organizing today's Yin-Cheng Distinguished Lecture, and a special thanks to our esteemed speaker, Venerable Shen Kai, and discussant Professor Fan Weili. Unfortunately, due to my current engagement in Italy, I am able to attend the event live. I have, however, recorded this message to convey my appreciation and support for this important occasion. Buddhism has a profound impact on Chinese culture since its arrival, especially with its concept of interdependent origination, which helped expand Chinese thought and develop broader understanding of the inevitability of life. While Taoism and Confucianism emphasize spontaneity and vitality, Buddhism presents a different perspective by highlighting the inevitability of cause and effect. The view of karmic causality provides the Chinese people with a long-term vision of life, success and failure, and not confined to a single term of life, but are tied to accumulation of merit and the cultivation of wisdom over countless lives. This comprehensive outlook influenced the development of Chinese philosophy, even contributed to the flourishing of Chinese art during the Tang and Song dynasty. Buddhism has since become deeply integrated into the daily life of Chinese people, embodying the higher spiritual rank that scholars and intellectuals has long aspired to. Mr. Zhao Puchu, in particular, played a vital role in positioning Buddhism within a framework of Chinese culture during the special realm of political, economy, and social change. This notion of Buddhism as culture has significant implication, situating Buddhism as a key component of Chinese civilization, alongside Confucianism and Taoism. Mr. Zhao Puchu's contribution has not only strengthened the transmission of Buddhism within China, but have also helped the world gain a deeper understanding of Chinese Buddhism. Today, I would like to thank Professor Junhua Chen once again for organizing this important lecture, express my appreciation to Venerable Sheng Kai and Professor Fan Wenli for their invaluable contribution. I believe that all participants, scholar and student alike, will find today's discussion deeply inspiring, fostering a greater understanding of the cultural, social, and practical dimension of Chinese Buddhism. As we stand on the shoulder of the giant like Zhao Puchu, we must continue to explore and develop the social, cultural, and everyday relevance of Buddhism, ensuring that the Dharma continue to spread globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm now inviting my colleague, Vicky Baker, to introduce our speaker and discussion. Vicky?
Thank you very much. We are so delighted to welcome today Professor Sheng Kai, who is currently the Vice Dean of the Institute for Ethics and Religious Studies at Tsinghua University, and also a professor in the Department of Philosophy. He is the chief expert of the major project of the National Social Sciences Fund, Social Life History of Chinese Buddhist Monks, and the vice director of the Research Institute of the Buddhist Culture of China, and also the editor-in-chief of Buddhist Studies. He specializes in Buddhist schools of the South and North dynasties, the relationship between Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, Chinese Buddhist social history, modern and contemporary Buddhism, and comparative studies between Buddhism and Western philosophy. And we're equally delighted to also welcome our discussant for today, Professor Fan Wenli, who is an associate researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and an associate professor at the University of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She also serves as the Secretary General of the Chinese Society for Eastern Philosophy. She's published a monograph called Action and Its Results, a study based on the karma, maybe I'll ask her to pronounce the title of her book. It explores the debates in Indian philosophy about self, causality, and other issues. With that, I will pass it to our speaker for tonight, Professor Sheng Kai. Welcome.
Okay.
Are you able to turn your video on as well?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
谢谢那个
Thank you
UBC 的邀请
to the invitation from UBC, and we thank you to Tzu Foundation for their invitation.
我今天跟大家
Today,
分享的
I would like
题
to
目
share with everyone
赵朴初
the topic
佛教史
on
文化
Zhao
的观念
Puchu's idea
为
of Buddhism
当
as
代
culture
中国
and
大
the
陆佛教
revival
的
of
复兴
Buddhism in mainland China.
我对这个题目的思考主要
My
来源
thinking
于
on this
自
topic
己
comes
小时候
from
在
my
中国
childhood.
佛学院读书
When I was studying
常
in a
常
Chinese
听起
Buddhist academy, I
赵
often
老
heard about
对这个问题
Zhao
的
Puchu's
演讲
thinking and
所
his
以
talks
我
on
整
this
个研
topic.
究就是
So
从
my research started
从
from
1993年开始
1993
在中国佛学院读书时
when I
代
was still a
对
student.
赵朴老的观察
in my observations about Zhao Puchu and my thinking. I only first started writing in year 2000 on this topic. Since year 2000, because of the passing away of Zhao Puchu, so the Chinese Buddhist Academy compiled the collected works of Zhao Puchu. And in 2010, I started to have a more comprehensive observation of Zhao Puchu, and having thought about this and written about it for 15 years, this year I published a book titled Zhao Puchu and Modern Chinese Buddhism. This is my work over 15 years on and off, and through his collected works and related materials, I thought about his ideology, his thinking, thought about his role in the revival of Chinese Buddhism, the problems he saw, and his solutions. Throughout this process, I feel that Zhao Puchu's thinking, most importantly, comes down to four questions. The first is Buddhism as culture. The second is about the summary of fine traditions of Chinese Buddhism. The third is about humanistic Buddhism. The fourth is about Buddhism and a socialist society, including interactions with the international community. So I am talking about the chapter 2 from this book, Buddhism as Culture and Revival of Buddhism in Mainland China. If we review the collective works of Zhao Puchu, we can see that his idea of Buddhism as culture began to take shape around 1984. Because prior to this, his speeches and articles did not mention similar viewpoints. In 1984, the Chinese Academy of Buddhism started an organization called the Institution for the Study of Chinese Buddhist Philosophy, History, and Literature. And from the name, in 1984, the Buddhist Academy wanted to establish study of philosophy and history, but in 1984, it was renamed the this change is very important. This was caused by the development of Buddhism as culture. And as we translate this into English, we can do it as Buddhism is culture or Buddhism as culture. I personally support the translation Buddhism as culture. When we think back to Buddhism as culture, we need to think back to the 20th century. In the 1980s, around the 1980s, in the early 80s, as it was at the end of the Cultural Revolution. So during the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, China's religious policies completely deviated from the right track, taking a far left approach. And religion was classified as feudal superstition and faced intense criticism, leading to the prohibition of all religious activities. And in April 1980, the Chinese Communist Party began to reaffirm the policy of religious freedom. On April 9th of the same year, the People's Daily published an interview with Xiao Xianfa, then Director of State Administration for the Religious Affairs of the PRC, in which he stated religion is a result from the history. Materialists must respect this historic fact. He emphasized that religious beliefs are a matter of thought and should not be addressed through coercive or exclusive measures. So while there are differences in people's religious beliefs, they all share a common goal of building prosperous motherland and achieving the objectives of the four modernizations. Despite the government's new statements on religious policies, many departments and people still lack the awareness and remain stuck in the past far-left ideological thinking. So if we look back on the interview at that time, it's really about reversing the tracks that have been taken during the Cultural Revolution. So in 1982, the CCP issued document number 19 of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, titled, very importantly, Basic Views and Policies on Religious Issues During the Socialist Period of PRC, calling for the full restoration and implementation of the policy of religious freedom. And this takes a lot of effort and over a long period of time. And throughout this process, as we can see, since 1982, there was a form taking shape in society to understand Buddhism, to relieve society from wrong views about Buddhism. And Zhao Puchu began by using methods of self-awareness and self-reflection, publishing he was sort of talking about these three things, and he published his theories in an article, understanding the insight into some theoretical and practical issues of religion, which systematically describe the 5 fundamental characteristics of religion in China. These are mass orientation, ethnic relevance, international reach, complexity, and long-term presence. And on December 5th, 1983, in his report of 30 Years of Chinese Buddhism at the 4th Council of the Chinese Buddhist Association, Zhao Puchu advocated for vigorously promoting the academic research tradition within Chinese Buddhism. So first, he was thinking about there are aspects of Chinese Buddhism that were very beneficial to the society, and he promoted this academically. Then in September 1984, at the graduation ceremony for undergraduates at the Chinese Buddhist Academy, Zhao Puchu strongly urged we should fully recognize the value of Buddhism in the academic field and fully estimate its status in Chinese cultural history. To carry forward the fine traditions of Buddhism and ensure the rich cultural heritage of our country, we should continue to delve into Buddhist studies. So this is something we saw from 1982, 1983, and 84. He started from academic studies of the tradition, and he also took part in this. In 1984 and 1986, Zhao Puchu published several articles and speeches, such as Buddhism and Chinese culture, the relationship between Buddhism and socialist spiritual civilization construction, researching the influence of of Buddhism and Chinese culture. He tirelessly promoted the idea of Buddhism as culture. So this all happened in 1984, which I see as a watershed, and because he started to really combine Buddhism and Chinese culture, emphasizing that Buddhism as culture. And this idea, actually, how do we understand it? This is in the past 20, 30 years, whether it be in Buddhist circles or in academia, this is a very important debate that's going on. And in this debate, first we can look at it from the history of the society. For example, in June 18th to July 2nd, 1988, Zhao Puchu investigated the implementation of religious policies in Chengdu, Dazhi, Emei Mountain, and in August 3rd, when he returned, he prepared a research report titled "Religious Policies Must Be Seriously Implemented in Major Buddhist Temples and Mountains." In that report, he mentioned certain departments have labeled monks in Shengshou Temple and at the Dazhi with feudal superstition and spiritual pollution. He also noted that these departments, while opposing feudal superstition and spiritual pollution, had renamed Buddhist spirit boxes to fundraising boxes. He felt that at the beginning of at the primary stage of socialism, cultural construction should include religion as part of cultural work. He also quoted Mao Zedong and other important people in Chinese politics. So that was when he first brought up the idea of Buddhism as culture. And on April 22nd, 1987, the Research Institute of Buddhist Culture of China was officially established. It was how this idea was actualized. And Zhao Puchu served as honorary director with Zhou Shaoliang as director, and later Wu Limin, who succeeded him. And if you look at this photo on the right, he is holding Yuan Shumin, who published an article that mentioned my previous life was a Zen monk. So Zhao Puchu, when he talked to us, he often mentioned this. He did not ask Yuan Shumin about how he had this knowledge, and he wrote a poem to recollect this account from Yuan Shumin. And they published this annual journal, The Voice of Dharma, academic edition, which was then later renamed Buddhist Culture since 1989. And in 1991, it became Buddhist Research, which I am editor of. It is now a semi-annual publication. The establishment of the China Buddhist Cultural Research Institute and the publication of Buddhist Culture Journal can be seen as the formal establishment of Zhao Puchu's Buddhism as culture concept and mark the transformation of this idea into action. You can see this from this photo, in 1984, we can see it as the publicizing of Buddhism as culture. And then it was realized in 1986 with the establishment of the Research Institute. Now, this you can see in 1989, the journal Buddhism, Buddhist Culture was published. And in 1992, Buddhist Culture turned from an annual publication into a quarterly publication. And in 1994, it turned into a bi-monthly publication. And in 1991, the Buddhist Research Institute also established this journal, Buddhist Research. It used to be an annual publication, and when I took over this journal in 2017, we turned it into a semi-annual publication. The second important part is how we understand the concepts of religion, Buddhism, and culture. We need to understand Zhao Puchu's definition of religion. So it is important to clarify the definition of religion before diving in. Every philosopher and religious person may have a different definition of religion. So it's necessary that we clarify what is meant. Zhao Puchu said, religion is a specific form of ideological belief that contains cultural connotations. It is a social entity formed by millions of believers involving relationships among masses, ethnicities, and nations, and has significant impacts on society's politics, economy, and culture. It is a phenomenon that has occurred throughout the history of all nations and will continue to exist for a long time. From this definition, we can see that it encompasses three very important aspects. The first is faith, second is culture, the third is the social entity. From these three levels, religion includes three dimensions: ideological belief, culture, and social entity, and characterized by mass orientation, ethnic relevance, international reach, complexity, and long-term presence. In this definition includes his own understanding of the essence of Buddhism and its characteristics. Which includes religion with different extensions and connotations. The first is form of religious belief, and the second is the actual social entity of religion. This distinguishment is different from other scholars have proposed in the past. And of these two concepts, the former is the concept of religion used in Marxist discussions, while the latter is the concept used in laws, regulations, policies, and practical work. So as we understand Buddhism, we need to be clear what train of thought we are starting with in trying to make this understanding, whether it's from the belief system or from the actual social entity. And I think Zhao Puchu's advocacy of religion as culture, he focuses on one of the three dimensions. of culture. So religion as culture does not encompass the whole of religion, but it is emphasized. So inheriting the culture of Buddhism is important to the inheritance of Chinese culture. So this is a very functionalist approach to the definition or to the understanding of Buddhism. This is a methodology to respond to the misunderstandings of Buddhism and religion in general during and after the Cultural Revolution. So while religious ideological beliefs are purely personal matters, the social entity aspect of religion is the foundation of religious work, with the hope that the government will fully implement the policy of religious freedom.
So in
terms of cultural connotations, religion serves as a link for individuals to social life. It can also be said that cultural religion and social culture are intimately linked together. I also published a paper recently treating this topic in more detail. We see culture as the connection between Buddhism and society at large. In this thinking, I share a lot of commonality with Zhao Puchu. Zhao Puchu aimed to change people's understanding of religion through the promotion of religion is culture and to expand the role of religion in social life. And through this bridge, we can expand the reach of Buddhism into social life. This is how I think we should understand it. So since 1986, Zhao Puchu has discussed the idea of religion as culture, emphasizing its potential to serve the construction of socialist spiritual civilization until 1997. In these 11 years, in formally documented locations, Zhao Puchu mentioned Chairman Mao 8 times, Qian Xuesen 9 times, and Fan Wenlan 8 times. So, in looking at Zhao Puchu's definition, I can see that he has defines religion in 3 layers with 5 properties, and he uses it as a guide for adaptation and the Chinesization of religion with Buddhism as an example. He also focuses on the 5 traditions of Chinese Buddhism. In terms of thoughts and beliefs, there is complexity. So, Buddhism serving a socialist spiritual civilization is something that is important to our understanding today. And from the channelization of religion, he also introduces artisticization within the fine traditions of Chinese Buddhism. he also stresses academic research. And from my own combing through the material, I think this is very easy to see. Number three, how do we understand the conceptual connotation of Buddhism as culture? From Zhao Puchu's thinking, Buddhist culture as an important component of Chinese culture. Zhao Puchu has identified two key characteristics of Chinese culture. First, its historical continuity. Zhao Puchu he emphasizes that Buddhist culture was an important component of Chinese culture. We can see this in academic publications at that time. We saw religious people not only took their concepts to academia, but also into practice. And Zhao Puchu identified two characteristics of Chinese culture. First, it is historically continuous, as the cultural traditions have remained unbroken for thousands of years. Second, it's national cohesion, with the culture of the Chinese nation being a collaborative creation of the 56 ethnic groups in China, which has never experienced fragmentation. As a vital part of Chinese culture, Buddhist culture comprises three main components. And these three main components include the Tibetan Buddhism, the Dai or Thai Buddhism derived from Theravada Buddhism, Buddhist tradition, and the Han Chinese Buddhism. And these three traditions of Buddhism profoundly reflect the historical continuity and national cohesion in China. Tibetan Buddhism blends Indian Buddhism with local culture, upholding the original teachings of the Buddha while also integrating elements from Han Chinese and Indian traditions. And at the same time, Dai Buddhism primarily retains the traditions of Theravada Buddhism, serving as the foundation of Dai culture in different regions. So this concept that we see here is the result of his work from 1984 to up until his death in 2002. And this discourse has affected China in whether in academia or in popular sentiment. At the same time, Zhao Puchu believed that the integration of Buddhism with Han Chinese ethnic culture is reflected in its academic, artistic, and social dimensions. What is meant by its academic connections? First, Buddhism has developed into a scholarly tradition through its association with Chinese speculative philosophy, conducting in-depth studies of its doctrines, which has resulted in the establishment of various schools and contributed to the overall flourishing of Buddhism itself. Moreover, this is the pinnacle of culture in China. Moreover, Buddhism has evolved artistically by combining with China's exquisite craftsmanship utilizing the sophisticated artistic techniques and methods of Han culture to express its teachings and doctrines, thus transforming Buddhism into a vibrant treasury of art. We can see this in the Dunhuang art. We can see it in Buddhist architecture. So art is not just Buddhist accomplishment. Of course, it is also accomplishment of the rest of society. But Buddhism plays a very important role. Now, what is socialization? Well, Buddhism has evolved socially by aligning with Chinese ideals of life, fostering a close relationship with Chinese society. For example, renowned Buddhist monks and virtuous figures in China have engaged in various social initiatives, such as building bridges and roads, improving irrigation, planting trees, providing medical care, offering disaster relief, establishing welfare projects, as well as promoting national unity, and preserving cultural heritage. This is how Buddhism is integrated into the society. Charity is a very important part for Buddhism to enter the rest of society. This is why we see that Buddhism in late Qing and the Republican period, Buddhism at that time provided its spiritual function, but it did not fully present the depth of Buddhist content. So I think charity is the best way for Buddhism to engage with society. So the two best methods are through culture and art. The other is through charity. These are the two methods that I think are the best ways for Buddhism to engage with society. So one hand is culture and academics, and the other is charity. Now I wish to talk about the profound influence of Buddhism on Chinese culture. The academic, artistic, and social dimensions of Buddhism reflect three key levels of its adaptation within Chinese culture, rendering it an inseparable part of the cultural landscape. The concept of Buddhism as culture emphasizes the profound influence Buddhism has exerted on Chinese culture. And this also underscores the central role that Buddhism plays. In his 1986 article, researching the influence of Buddhism on Chinese culture and the relationship between Buddhism and Chinese culture, Zhao Puchu explored the extensive and deep impact Buddhism has had on Chinese philosophy, literature, art, astronomy, music, and medicine. The third level is Buddhism's contribution to the construction of socialist spiritual civilization. Buddhism should carry forward its historical traditions and achievements in academicization, artistic expression, and social integration, continuing to contribute to the construction of socialist spiritual civilization in the new era. The concept that Buddhism as culture provides a necessary foundation and pathway for the Buddhist community to serve the development of socialist spiritual civilization. On March, so between 1983 and 1986, Zhao Puchu created a lot of discourse in this. For example, on March 31st, 1986, Zhao Puchu spoke about the relationship between Buddhism and the construction of socialist spiritual civilization. Through its social functions, Buddhism could play a significant role in building material civilization, with temples engaging in production, social welfare, and relief efforts. However, Zhao Puchu aimed to integrate Buddhism into socialist spiritual civilization through the promotion of Buddhism as culture. So, on January 20th, 1994, during a seminar on religion and its adaptation to socialist society, Zhao Puchu systematically discussed how Buddhist thought and culture could serve the goals of socialist spiritual civilization. So this is something that still needs to be worked on. And in this seminar in 1994, he discussed this systematically, how Buddhist thought could be of service to a socialist society. This was a very important seminar. Its repercussions are still felt today. Even today, we are still discussing this topic after 30 years. Since 1994, this seminar, I think it established the theoretical foundation for Buddhism in a socialist society. So how do we understand Buddhism as culture? Well, I think we need to look at the history and to summarize the concept and also observe the history in society. So my research is from the concept and from sociology, from the social history. As a leader in the Buddhist community, Zhao's positioning of Buddhism as culture was not an academic or cultural classification. He did not do a very systematic exhibition of this. Rather, he aimed to highlight Buddhism's cultural significance and reshape public misconceptions and biases. It was a functional classification. So, as I think about and read his collected works, I see that Zhao Puchu's address within the Buddhist community, he rarely mentioned Buddhism as culture. So this is so Buddhism as culture was something to be expressed to the larger society. This, so we can see this this lineage. Now, he suggested within Buddhist circles that the development of Buddhist scholarship and its adaptation to modern society must be predicated on strengthening faith and should never come at the cost of diminishing that faith. So his idea, Buddhism as culture, was meant for society as a whole. It was not meant for the Buddhist society. And this was not a religious or Buddhist statement. Now, this also created some debate. One is to some people want to defend Zhao Puchu, some people want to defend Buddhist culture, but this is perhaps a false dichotomy. If we understand Buddhism as culture, how it came about, then it is clear that this statement was made to address the larger society, a response to the societal changes. As we can see, when Zhao Puchu talks within the Buddhist community, he does not emphasize this viewpoint. So to conclude, from the perspective of the four modes of teaching, the statement Buddhism as culture carries the following meanings. First, the worldly method, which encourages societal recognition and appreciation of Buddhism. That is, Buddhism can, this is to gain acceptance from society. Second, individual method, indicating Buddhism's service to socialist spiritual civilization. And looking at Buddhism as culture, it can be seen to be of service to socialist spiritual civilization. The third method, the third specific method, addresses misconceptions that label Buddhism as feudal superstition or spiritual pollution, and to promote Buddhism as culture. And of course, this ties back to the second point, the individual method, putting Buddhism in service of socialist spiritual civilization. The fourth, the ultimate method, refers back to Zhao Puchu's assertion about the importance of Buddhist culture and the application of wisdom to build a humanistic Buddhism that enlightens and purifies hearts. So these, I believe we have clarified the context for Buddhism as culture. This is a functionalist classification. And when we come back to the Buddhist community itself, this we can see it in the vein of humanistic Buddhism. It is to achieve the goals of Buddhism, which is done through its actions in the human world. When we see discourses like this published in the Buddhist journals, and we can understand these from the perspective of the four modes of teaching, or 四悉檀 in Chinese. So this is, in my research, some people feel that we should include more of Zhao Puchu's letters and his work documents, but I feel that this material do not have much importance because they are just records of the work that is done. They are not very meaningful for conceptual work. So as we study an important person, and as we define the problem and the method through understanding the problem, through the methodology, and through the work we actually put into research, we can be selective in the material that we consult. So this is my thinking in my report to everyone today. In summary, Buddhism as culture has taken hold in Chinese society. Second, it has helped Buddhism, it has relieved Buddhism from conceptions and established the foundation for the revival of Buddhism in China today. So thank you, everyone. Thank Professor Junhua Chen for his invitation. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Shinkai, for those comments and that providing that important history. I'd like to invite now Professor Fan to deliver some comments on the presentation.
Hi, 大家好。
Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to take part today, and thank you for UBC and Tsuji for your invitation. So we've waited for this book, and we're very grateful to have this opportunity to hear his sharings today. So Professor Senkai's presentation on Zhao Puchu's concept of Buddhism as culture and the revival of Buddhism in contemporary mainland China examines a famous statement made by Zhao Puchu 40 years ago, Buddhism as culture. He first traced the historical background and circumstances under which this statement was made. Zhao Puchu was put forward this notion about around 1984, during a time when the central government of China began to reaffirm the policy of religious freedom. At that time, there were still many misconceptions about Buddhism in society, with many people continuing to mistakenly regard it as a feudal superstition. To counter this mistaken social perception, Zhao Puchu promotes the concept of Buddhism as culture through writing a series of articles, delivering speeches, and other public engagements. In his speeches, he frequently referenced the examples of Mao Zedong, Qian Xuesen, and Fan Wenlan, respectively, a great revolutionary, scientist, and renowned historian, to strengthen the persuasiveness of his argument. Professor Senkai also introduced Zhao Puchu's understanding of the concept of religion, Buddhism, and culture. Zhao Puchu believed that when we talk about religion, we should distinguish between religion as a form of faith and the entirety of religion as a reality. The former refers to the pure psychological world of faith, which is the aspect criticized by Marxism, with the latter encompasses philosophy, literature, art, monastic organization, religious rituals, social connections of religion, and more, representing a multifaceted existence. From this latter perspective, religion can be understood as a form of culture in a broad sense. Zhao Puchu's explanation of Buddhism as culture is based on three main points. First, Buddhist culture is an important part of Chinese culture, with Buddhism deeply integrated into Chinese thought, institutions, and society, becoming an intrinsic part of Chinese culture. Second, after Buddhism was introduced into China, it had a significant influence of Chinese philosophy, literature, painting, and other cultural fields. Third, in the new era, Buddhism can continue to contribute to Chinese culture through education, science, cultural development, and construction of thought and morality. Professor, these are the main information shared by Professor Shenkai. So, to my knowledge, this research of Professor Senkai is not only an academic study of Zhao Puchu's thought, but also a reflection of his own involvement in contemporary Buddhist cultural undertakings. So regarding Buddhist cultural efforts, he is not only an interpreter, but also an active participant. In addition to serving as a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Tsinghua University, Professor Senkai is also the main leader of the Research Institute. It can be said that he has inherited Zhao Puchu's blueprint for Buddhist culture and has been continuously engaged in the dissemination of Buddhist culture. Last year, the 10-volume bilingual Chinese and English work, Encyclopedia of Chinese Buddhism, promoted by the Research Institute of Buddhist Culture of China, was published. This encyclopedia was originally initiated and compiled under the guidance of Zhao Puchu in the 1950s and 60s, but due to the various historical reasons, it had never been fully published. More than 60 years later, the editorial team assembled by Professor Senkai completed the editing and proofreading, and the work was finally published in both Chinese and English. Therefore, after Zhao Puchu's statement, Buddhism as culture was put forward, it indeed became a guiding principle of subsequent work within the Chinese Buddhist community. And Professor Sen Kai has been an important participant in this cultural endeavor. Regarding the article itself, Zhao Puchu's assertion that Buddhism as culture reminds me of Dao An's famous statement, Buddha Dharma could not establish itself without relying on the rulers. In a narrow sense, this means that if Buddhism does not rely on state governance, it would be difficult for its cause and to advance. In a broader sense, it can be interpreted to mean that if Buddhism does not rely on the traditional Chinese political structure, cultural concepts, and social ecology, it would be difficult for its development to proceed. In ancient China, Confucianism was the dominant political ideology, and its view on religion essentially determined the trajectory of the relationship between religion and the state. Confucianism, as a highly humanistic cultural tradition, adopted a religious attitude of respecting the spirits of while keeping a distance. It applied the principle of employing religious ways for moral governance, which, while adhering to basic principles of tolerance, limited religion to specific educational and moral spheres, allowing it to play a role in reinforcing state authority and maintaining social stability. In addition to the notion of Buddhism as culture, Zhao Puchu actually proposed another important assertion, the three fine traditions of Chinese Buddhism. These include the tradition of balancing farming and Chan meditation, the tradition of emphasizing academic research, and the tradition of international friendly exchanges. This assertion not only looks at the past as a summary of the traditions of Chinese Buddhism, but also looks to the future, positioning Chinese Buddhism with the political and social environment of the time. Just over 1 week ago, the World Buddhist Forum held in Ningbo, China, released the Xuedong Mountain Declaration, which put forward 4 proposals promoting the healthy transmission of Buddhism, implementing the digitization of Buddhist scriptures, strengthening research on contemporary Buddhist thought and practice, and actively conducting friendly Buddhist exchanges. These proposals reflect the current position of Chinese Buddhism, addressing its development, its cultural endeavor, and its role in diplomatic affairs. The Xuedong Mountain Declaration essentially introduces a new position in the context of today's era, representing the inheritance and development of the position proposed in the 3 fine traditions of Chinese Buddhism. Whether it was Dao An's statement for the over 1,600 years ago that Buddha Dharma could not establish itself without relying on the rulers, Zhao Puchu's notion from 40 years ago that Buddhism as culture, or today's Xuedong Mountain Declaration, they all respond to the same questions. How does Buddhism find its space for survival, its path for development, and the meaning of its existence within the specific social and cultural ecology of this time and place? So this is my sharing.
我简单回应一下文丽的这个评议我觉得
let me briefly respond. I think this commentary has put my thought in a greater context of history and tradition, and understanding Buddhism as a functional social entity. We need to be aware of the social functions of Buddhism. I think this is something that a lot of people lack in understanding the Buddhism in the context of Chinese society.
如果说只是从一种他者的眼光，实际上是很难进入。
If we look at Buddhism in China as a third person, it's very hard to understand it deeply.
我想这里面最重要的还是一个
I think what's most important is how we understand this came to be, how Buddhism as culture came to be, and how Buddhism is passed on. This is also part of dependent origination, as the Buddha taught. There is not one standard for Buddhism. I think as overseas scholars look at Buddhism in China, I think this is something that they should take into account, to take dependent origination into account and how these conditions have affected the development of Buddhism without considering these external factors and only considering religious freedom as unhinged freedom. That does not really exist. Buddhism does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within social contexts. And secondly, how do we understand the revival of Buddhism in China? First, I think we need to first understand China's politics and society from the various changes in Chinese society, including the Cultural Revolution and others. How do we understand the Chinese society in this context? Once we understand this background, are we ready to understand Buddhism in China today? Third, as a Buddhist myself, I think Buddhism started from the Sakyamuni Buddha, and it has a mechanism within itself of the two truths doctrine.
它听起来看是一个口头禅，但实际上不是，它也是个方法论。
This is an important methodology for us, which guarantees, which helps Buddhism from getting involved in religious wars, getting into social conflicts.
我为什么觉得四悉檀这种？四悉檀就是二谛檀，第一悉檀就是圣义谛。
The four methodologies,
三个呢算圣义谛啊，算世俗谛。
the four modes of teaching are also can also be understood in this way. They are different different ways of approaching different problems. So I think we shouldn't expect there to be a standard form of Buddhism. If we look around the world, whether it be any specific country or continent, we can see that Buddhism is necessarily adapted to the culture, to the environment in which it is developing. That's why I think in the 1980s, in those years, if we think in this way, then we can see that Buddhism as culture, how this concept came about. It first came about from from within Buddhism, the methodology, the way of looking at the world through the two truths doctrine. And with this methodology, a systematic methodology, Buddhism passed from India to China and continued for over 2,000 years. So I want to thank Professor Fan Li for her comments, and I want to thank everyone.
Thank you again, Professor Shenkai, and thank you, Professor Fan, for your very insightful comments. We can now open up the floor for discussion. If anybody has questions, you are welcome to either type them into the chat, or you can simply unmute your microphone and ask your question. You're welcome to use either Chinese or English. Give a minute for people to think. Maybe they're thinking of a question. I don't hear. Oh, and perhaps you can see in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have read the chat. OK。他的这个问题是这个人叫冠凡吧，他是想阐
So we
述一
have
下
a question from Guan
赵
Fan.
朴初是否对当时
He
策划日本的
asks,
佛教文化佛教文物展有什
when
么看法？
did Zhao
这
Puchu
种文物展寻求
have
海外的
any
模式，创造什
what
么样的
his
社
thoughts
会影
were
响？
about organizing the
就是实际
exposition
上
on
就是
Japanese
我觉得
Buddhism, and
在
number
赵朴老
two,
时代吧，
what
赵朴老爷子有
this
策划
type
这
of
个佛教文
exhibition
物的展
for
览。
of
我不知道
overseas
他当时是
material
不是
had
策划了
on the society.
日本的佛教文物展，
Well,
可能有，但是
so
我
the
是知道
speaker is not
当时
aware
在
of
90年代的时候
a
最有影响
specific
的
instance
是中国
when
佛教
Zhao
文物
Puchu organized this
我现在慢慢想起
exhibition
来，
of
一个是在法国
Japanese
有一个展览，那个金海法
Buddhist
师带队，
materials.
那是很有名。 这个
But he
当时
remembers
金海法师带队，那么在法国引起很大的轰动。对，我现在想起来，
Venerable Jinghai,
中国
who
佛教文化研究所还组织过
organized
泰
an
国的
exhibition in France, which was very well received.
那么这么来看， 实
And
际上
there was another
我觉得有关于日
exhibition
本的佛
in
教呢，倒
Thailand.
是有一个很，就是说
And
我有
in
个看
terms
法，
of Japanese
实际
Buddhism,
上当
my
代中国
thoughts
大陆佛
are
教的复兴啊，是有一个历
the
史
current
契机。
revival of
这个
Buddhism
契
in
机呢，
China has
就是
its
1978年
historical
开始，这个
conditions,
日
causes,
本的
and
鉴
that
真
is in
相回国这么一个历
1987.
史事件。这个历史事件对当代中国大陆
There
佛教的
was
复兴是一个根本的
a
推动。
return of
就是说
some Buddhist
当
artifact
时
from
因
Japan
为
to China,
要
and
接
which
待
had
那么日本的访华团，
because we
因为
needed
鉴真
to
相回国是
receive
要来北
the
京，去扬州，到洛阳，
the
到天台
Japanese
山。 那
delegation
么文革的后
to
期呢，这些
to
寺院都
multiple
已经被
locations
生人。
in China,
所以当时
to
从外
multiple
交政策的
temples.
角度，就
So
鼓励
from
这个
the
过去
perspective
还
of
俗的这个僧人
diplomacy,
出家，然后鼓励新
they
的僧人
encouraged
出家。 然后呢，
monastics who had
最
returned
重
to
要的
late
任务，
life
比
to
如
come
说
back to those
他们就
temples
是
which
接
were
待这个日本的
already
访华
empty.
团，
So they
就
were
是
able
所
to
以接待日
receive
本访华
the
团，就当
Japanese
时法源寺
delegation
就
to
是
China.
就
And at
成
that
为一个
time,
接待的地
Faoyuan
方。
Temple
所以
was
就
one
中
of
国佛教
these
中国佛学院的恢复，
locations.
也是普
And
老当
the
时的一个计划，
reestablishment
就是说
of
那这些
the
人接待完了，就
Chinese
在你在
Buddhist
这里去读
Academy
书，就开始有中国佛
was
学院的恢复。
also
这是
related to
第一个。
this. Zhao
第二
Puchu
个很重
encouraged
要的就是
those
说，
monks to
当
remain
时因为
monastic rather
接
than
待
return to
鉴
lay
真
life
相
again
回国，
after the
那么实际
delegation,
上因为
after
已经没有佛
the
像，
visit of the
这个时候呢，就
delegation.
从故宫这个借了，就是通过中央，所以
They
这故宫
also
的佛
borrowed
像器具，在洛阳的白马
Buddhist
寺，到天台山
relics,
的国清寺，
artifacts
故宫
from
里
the
包括
National
法源寺
Palace
在内，
Museum
当时都是故
for
宫
display
借了
at
很
the
多这
temples
个
because the
佛教的造
temples
像跟器具，
were
所以我觉得
already
这个也
devoid
是
of
当时一
these
个很重要的一个历史事件。
relics. So I
就是
think
如果
this is
说
was
我们回
something
到古老的
very
语境，
that
那么古
happened
老对
in
这
history
个
that was
中国佛教
very
文物在海外的
important
展
and
览，古老
relevant
是很热
to
心的，
the revival
因
of
为作为一个
Buddhism
文化
in
人
China
对于
today.
这种文化的展览都
And
是很有
for
那
these
么第二个就我刚才讲
exhibitions,
到的，
Zhao
就是
Puchu
文
was
化
also
是佛
very
教与社会的连接
eagerly,
点。
avidly
所
involved.
以通过这种
The
文物
second
的这
is
种转
through
型的海外模式呢，
the
实际
connection
上是
of
进行
uh,
两个沟通。
is
一
the
个呢
connection
是这个
of
不同国家文化的沟通，比如说
connection
日本
to the rest of
佛教文化
society
跟中国的佛教
through
文
these
化的文
visits.
化的沟通。第二
And
个
this
很重
is
要的，实际
also
上就是佛
communication
教跟
across
社会的
cultures.
沟通。
This was also a
这个
communication
展览
between
对
Buddhism
理
and the
解
rest
这
of
个佛
society.
教文
This is
化实
the
际上是有双
uh,
重的沟通作用。
contribution
就
that
是
these
说
exhibitions
一个
had.
是国家文化层面的
So
沟
if
通，
we
一个
look
是
at
佛教
the
跟
this
社会的沟
cultural
通，这两个角
communication
度
from Buddhism
都是很重要的。
to the rest of
我
society,
觉得如
that's
果
very
说普
important.
老当时策
I
划的
think if Zhao
这种
Puchu had
佛教的
organized
文物
this
展里面还有
exhibition from Japan, then very importantly, it also showed the rest of the world that China at that time was reviving its religions. It was implementing a policy of religious freedom. So, so this helped present to the rest of the world that China was taking actions in this direction. So concepts that are developed need to be actualized in society for to take hold, to become real. And I think today the Chinese Buddhist Academy continues to organize exhibitions like this to present the long history of Buddhism and to connect with the rest of society. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we still have time for another question if anyone has any other
Yeah,
questions.
okay. Yes,
Okay.
I find Zhang Jia has the question. 说想请盛凯教授，
So the question is, we want to ask Professor Sheng Kai. Zhao Puchu asked in around 1984, but are there other material that show the source of this concept? In other words, to what time can we trace this concept? Just like I have read in the Republican period, many monastics have already mentioned that Buddhism is culture. The professor is answering that this concept has long existed within academia, but 1984 was the time that was introduced to the wider society. And definitely during the Republican period, there was already this thinking starting from Master Taishi, and thinking about the crises, the problems that Buddhism faced during modernization of the country. And it is because of the work that Buddhism did in culture that it was able to get more approval from society. Charity itself can bring Buddhism into society, but by entering culture, Buddhism can be intertwined with the history of the society. So if we come back to Zhao Puchu's own development of his concepts in the 1960s, when he was writing, we can also see a bit of this. But
这个佛教是文化的这个整体内涵，而是这个说法它必须有一个明确的一个
this Buddhism as culture concept.
第二个呢，就是说它是需要有个社会语境。如果说离开的还是
For
回
it
到
to
那
be
个
really, its birth to be really recognized, it needs to be extensively discussed. It also needs to be introduced into the rest of society. So while it has existed in academic writings of Zhao Puchu since earlier, it was not introduced to the wider society until the 1980s.
要把放在学术史里面去思考，那这个是实际上是很悠长的，对吧？
So
这个思考是
definitely in academia, we can trace this back even further. You can say from the Republican period. You can also trace it back even earlier, such as the Songyuan Mingqing dynasties, as Buddhism was defining its own identity. So if we want to talk about this concept, what other people have mentioned this, of course, many people have in the history of of the academy, but Zhao Puchu brought it into the masses. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Professor Chen, I think I can hand it over to you for some closing comments.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Professor Shankai. Thank you, Professor Pavani, and also thanks all of our friends all over the world for attending this wonderful event by sacrificing your weekend time. I think this talk is very, very enlightening. For me, I think it's very unique because Professor Sens provide a very, very important perspective. Very important because he's both insiders and outsiders in the sense that he is a monastic, but he is also the university professors. So I think his perspectives is really unique, and it gives us a very balanced insight into this is very, very important ideas by Zhao Puchu. This is number one. Number two, I'm also very I think that I feel learned a lot because he is not only study Zhao Puchu's ideas from a kind of the third as a third party's a perspectives, because he has some very close personal contact with Zhao Puchu. So what he says here, I think, is also based on his very personal contact with Zhao Puchu. So I believe that he's provides something that's not so available from the other researchers. And about Zhao Puchu, I would like to emphasize that he is a real important person for modern Buddhism in mainland China. I think that the landscape of Buddhism would have been completely different without him and without his very important work. So in particular, I feel that his ideas on Buddhism is cultural. This is important because it emphasizes that we need to recognize that Buddhism is not a purely religious movement. Buddhism also have multiple functions, and one function is cultural functions. But of course, Buddhism also have other functions. And also, these ideas emphasize the importance to maintain the dynamic balance between the sacred and the seculars without a very active interventions into secular life. Buddhism will become won't be able to be a so-called active religions. And I think that Zhao Puchu's knew this very well. And so when he says that Buddhism is cultural, he actually wants people to believe that, in addition to shows that Buddhism has some impact on people's religious life, it may also be a very important cultural impact in the secular society. So this idea, I think, is very, very important. It's still meaningful, even for nowadays. I believe the modernizations of Buddhism probably has a great deal of to do with Buddhism's role in people's cultural life. So I want to thank Professor Shen Kai. I know that he's not so well physically now, but he still carry on his commitment to give us this wonderful talk. And I also want to thank our friends at Tzu Foundations for making this lab work in the lab work possible, and also making this lecture series possible. And I also want to thank my colleague, Vicky and Carol, for sacrificing their family time to make this talk go through quite so well. And I also want to invite our friend to continue to be with us in our futures lectures sponsored by this Yin-Cheng lecture series. So let me stop here, and thank you, and also have a wonderful weekend. Yeah.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Thank you to our speaker and to our discussant, Professor Fan. Have a wonderful weekend.
谢谢陈老师，谢谢。
谢谢叶老师，谢谢文丽谢谢海内外的朋友，谢谢我们慈济的朋友。
Thank you to everyone, and thank you to our friends at Tzu Chi. Thank you to the speakers.